In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and thick forests, there lived a boy named Ethan. He was 10 years old, with messy brown hair and big, curious eyes that always seemed to be looking for answers. Ethan wasn't like the other kids in his class. He didn't talk much, and he often kept to himself during recess. But it wasn't because he didn't want friends. It was more because life at home had taught him to stay strong and endure things without complaining. Ethan's family wasn't rich. They weren't even close to being comfortable. His father worked long hours at a factory where machines roared all day, and his hands were calloused from hard labor. His mother stayed at home, taking care of everything else, cooking meals, mending clothes, and making sure their small house felt warm despite the cracks in the walls. Money was tight, but love filled every corner of their home. Every morning, Ethan's father would wake up early to pack his son's lunch before heading off to work. It wasn't anything fancy. A peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and sometimes, if they were lucky, a cookie or two. Still, Ethan cherished those lunches because they reminded him how much his parents cared about him. But school wasn't easy for Ethan. While some kids laughed and played tag during breaks, Ethan usually sat alone under a tree, eating his simple meal quietly. And then there was Mr. Grayson, his 5th grade teacher. Mr. Grayson was tall and stern, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He ruled his classroom with an iron fist, punishing students for the smallest mistakes. Some kids thought he was strict but fair, while others whispered behind his back that he was mean. For Ethan, though, Mr. Grayson wasn't just strict, he was cruel. It started subtly at first. One day after lunch, Mr. Grayson walked over to Ethan's desk and picked up his lunch bag. "Let me see what you've brought today," he said in a tone that left no room for argument. Ethan hesitated but handed it over. Mr. Grayson opened the bag, glanced inside, and nodded. "No junk food. Good." Then, instead of giving it back, he carried it to his own desk and set it down. At first, Ethan assumed Mr. Grayson was just checking to make sure everyone followed the rules about healthy eating. But the next day, the same thing happened, and the day after that. Soon, Ethan realized something unsettling. Mr. Grayson wasn't inspecting his lunch, he was taking it. The sandwiches, the apples, the occasional cookies, they all disappeared into Mr. Grayson's desk drawer or his mouth. Ethan tried not to show how upset he was, but inside, he felt angry and helpless. Why did this have to happen to him? What had he done wrong? The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they just didn't care. The other kids were too busy chatting or playing games to pay attention to what happened to Ethan's lunch. When he tried to tell his father about it one evening, his dad brushed it off. "Teachers are just doing their jobs," he said firmly. "Don't exaggerate." But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply unfair. Each stolen lunch felt like another piece of his dignity being chipped away. Little did he know, his father was starting to suspect that something wasn't right. That suspicion would soon lead to a plan, one that would change everything for Ethan and teach Mr. Grayson a lesson he wouldn't forget. Every day at lunchtime, Ethan would sit quietly in the corner of the cafeteria, trying to enjoy what little food he had brought from home. The peanut butter sandwiches weren't fancy, and the apples were often slightly bruised, but they were his, carefully packed by his father each morning. Yet, no matter how hard Ethan tried to savor those meals, he rarely got the chance to finish them. Mr. Grayson always found a way to take them away. It started as something small, almost unnoticeable. On the first day it happened, Ethan thought maybe Mr. Grayson was just being strict about school rules. After all, teachers often reminded students not to bring unhealthy snacks or soda to school. But when Mr. Grayson grabbed Ethan's lunch bag without explanation and carried it back to his desk, Ethan began to feel uneasy. At first, he convinced himself that it was a one-time thing. Surely, Mr. Grayson wouldn't do it again. But he did. And again. And again. By the third day, Ethan realized this wasn't random. It was a pattern. Every single day, after everyone had finished eating, Mr. Grayson would stroll over to Ethan's desk with an air of authority, pick up the brown paper bag, and walk away without saying a word. Sometimes he'd glance inside as if inspecting it, but most days he didn't even bother. Instead, he'd tuck the bag under his arm or drop it into a drawer in his desk. Ethan watched silently, too afraid to speak up. He didn't want to draw attention to himself or risk making things worse. The other kids barely noticed what was happening. During lunch, they were too busy laughing, trading snacks, or playing games to pay attention to Ethan sitting alone. If anyone did see Mr. Grayson taking Ethan's lunch, they'd probably assumed it was part of some rule or punishment. No one questioned it, not even the other teachers who occasionally peeked into the classroom. To them, Mr. Grayson was known for being strict, so it didn't seem unusual that he might confiscate a student's belongings if he thought they broke the rules. For Ethan, though, the situation grew more unbearable with each passing day. Hunger gnawed at him during afternoon classes, making it hard to concentrate. He couldn't focus on math problems or spelling tests when his stomach felt empty and hollow. More than the physical discomfort, though, was the humiliation. Each stolen lunch made him feel smaller, less important. It was as if Mr. Grayson didn't see him as a person, a real boy with feelings, but as someone whose needs didn't matter. Desperate to avoid going hungry, Ethan started sneaking extra snacks into his backpack. He'd hide crackers or granola bars in his desk, hoping to grab a bite between classes when no one was looking. But Mr. Grayson seemed to have eyes everywhere. One afternoon, while searching through Ethan's desk for contraband, he found the stash of snacks. His face turned red with anger, and he scolded Ethan loudly in front of the entire class. "You think you can break the rules right under my nose?" he barked. "This is unacceptable behavior." Ethan wanted to protest, to explain that he wasn't breaking any rules, that he was only trying to survive. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he stared at the floor, his cheeks burning with shame. That evening, when he got home, he tried once more to tell his father what was happening. "Mr. Grayson takes my lunch every day," he said softly, his voice trembling. "And now he yelled at me because I hid some snacks." His father frowned, clearly skeptical. "Are you sure you're not exaggerating?" "Teachers don't steal from students, Ethan. Maybe you misunderstood." Ethan nodded sadly, knowing his father wouldn't believe him. Deep down, he felt defeated. How could he prove something that sounded so unbelievable? But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a spark of determination flickered inside him. He couldn't keep letting Mr. Grayson treat him this way. There had to be a way to make him stop, to show everyone the truth. Little did Ethan know, his father was starting to piece things together. Something about his son's story didn't add up, and it troubled him enough to consider taking action. That evening, as Ethan sat at the dinner table picking at his food, his father couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling that had been growing inside him. Something about Ethan's story didn't sit right. It wasn't just the fact that his son claimed Mr. Grayson was taking his lunch. It was the way Ethan looked when he talked about it. His shoulders slumped, his voice trembled, and there was a sadness in his eyes that broke his father's heart. This wasn't the confident, curious boy who used to ask endless questions or laugh at silly jokes. Something, or someone, was crushing his spirit. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Ethan's father decided to dig deeper. "Tell me exactly what happens," he said gently, leaning forward so Ethan would feel safe opening up. At first, Ethan hesitated, worried his father might dismiss him again. But seeing the seriousness in his dad's expression, he began recounting every detail. The stolen lunches, the constant hunger, the humiliation of being scolded for hiding snacks. As Ethan spoke, tears welled up in his eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of frustration or defeat. They were tears of relief because, finally, someone was listening. Ethan's father clenched his fists under the table, anger simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to march straight to the school and confront Mr. Grayson then and there, but he knew acting on impulse wouldn't solve anything. If he accused the teacher without proof, the situation could backfire, leaving Ethan even more vulnerable. No, he needed a plan, a clever one that would expose the truth once and for all. The next morning, while Ethan was still asleep, his father quietly prepared a special lunch. On the outside, it looked like any other meal. A neatly wrapped peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a small cookie tucked into a brown paper bag. But hidden beneath the food was something unexpected. A tiny recording device disguised as a cookie tin. The gadget was simple yet effective, capable of capturing clear audio for hours. It had been a gift from a coworker at the factory, intended for safety purposes, but now it would serve a different role. When Ethan woke up, his father handed him the lunch bag with a reassuring smile. "Just act normal today," he instructed. "Let Mr. Grayson take your lunch like he always does. Don't say anything about this." Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. What if the plan didn't work? What if Mr. Grayson figured out what was going on? Still, he trusted his father and promised to follow his instructions. As Ethan left for school, his father stood by the window, watching him walk down the street. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just about getting revenge on a cruel teacher. It was about protecting his son and teaching him an important lesson. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean you have to fight alone. Sometimes, it means finding smart ways to make people see the truth. Throughout the day, Ethan kept reminding himself to stay calm and act natural. During lunch, he placed the bag on his desk as usual, avoiding eye contact with Mr. Grayson. Sure enough, after recess, the teacher approached, snatched the bag, and retreated to his desk without a word. Ethan's heart raced as he watched Mr. Grayson unwrap the sandwich and take a bite. The tiny recorder captured every sound. The crinkling of the wrapper, the crunch of the apple, even the faint sigh of satisfaction as Mr. Grayson ate what wasn't his. Back at home, Ethan's father waited anxiously, pacing the living room floor. When Ethan returned from school, he gave his father a subtle nod, confirming that everything had gone according to plan. That night, they listened to the recording together, their faces lighting up with a mix of disbelief and triumph. Every chew, every swallow, every rustle of the paper bag was crystal clear. It was undeniable proof of Mr. Grayson's wrongdoing. For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled, a real, genuine smile. The weight on his shoulders began to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of confidence. Tomorrow, his father would take this evidence to the school and demand justice. And for the first time, Ethan believed that things might actually change. For him, and maybe even for others who had suffered silently under Mr. Grayson's rule. The next morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual. His heart was pounding with a mix of excitement and nervousness as he got ready for school. He couldn't stop thinking about the plan his father had set in motion. Would it work? What would happen if Mr. Grayson found out? These questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside and focused on following his father's instructions to the letter. When his father handed him the brown paper bag, Ethan felt its unusual weight. It wasn't just the sandwich, apple, and cookie inside. It was the tiny recorder hidden beneath the food. His father gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Remember, act normal," he said firmly but kindly. "Don't let him suspect anything." Ethan nodded, clutching the bag tightly as he walked to school. The crisp autumn air did little to calm his nerves. As he approached the classroom, he reminded himself to breathe deeply and stay composed. This was his chance to fight back, not with anger or confrontation, but with proof that could not be ignored. When lunchtime arrived, Ethan sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria, quietly eating the snacks his father had packed separately for him. He made sure to leave the brown paper bag untouched on his desk, exactly where Mr. Grayson would expect it to be. Around him, the other students chattered and laughed, completely unaware of the tension building inside Ethan. To them, everything seemed ordinary, but for Ethan, this was anything but a normal day. After recess, the moment of truth arrived. Mr. Grayson entered the classroom, his sharp eyes scanning the room as always. When his gaze landed on Ethan's desk, a flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Without hesitation, he strode over, picked up the lunch bag, and carried it back to his own desk. Ethan watched silently, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. Mr. Grayson unwrapped the sandwich with practiced ease, taking a large bite. The sound of chewing filled the otherwise quiet classroom. Ethan glanced around nervously, half expecting someone to notice what was happening. But no one did. The teacher continued eating, oblivious to the fact that every crunch, every swallow, was being recorded. Even the faint rustle of the paper bag as he reached for the apple was captured perfectly by the hidden device. As the minutes ticked by, Ethan began to feel a strange sense of empowerment. For so long, he had felt powerless against Mr. Grayson's cruelty. Now, for the first time, he was taking control, not through defiance or rebellion, but through cleverness and strategy. The thought gave him courage, and he sat up straighter, feeling a bit taller than before. When the bell rang signaling the end of lunch, Mr. Grayson casually tossed the empty lunch bag into the trash can near his desk. He didn't seem to notice, or care, that today's meal had been different from the others. To him, it was just another stolen lunch, another small victory in his campaign of intimidation. Little did he know, he had just sealed his own fate. Back home that evening, Ethan and his father gathered around the kitchen table to listen to the recording. The audio was clear, the crinkling of the wrapper, the sound of chewing, even the occasional sigh of contentment as Mr. Grayson enjoyed what wasn't his. Hearing it all played back was surreal for Ethan. It was proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof, of the injustice he had endured for weeks. His father's jaw tightened as he listened, his anger simmering just below the surface. But instead of acting impulsively, he took a deep breath and looked at Ethan. "We've got him now," he said firmly. "Tomorrow, we'll take this to the principal. No one can argue with evidence like this." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a wave of relief wash over him. The plan had worked. Mr. Grayson's days of stealing lunches were numbered. More importantly, Ethan realized that standing up for himself didn't mean facing battles alone. It meant having the courage to ask for help and trust those who loved him. As he drifted off to sleep that night, he dreamed of a future where he could walk into school without fear, knowing that justice was finally within reach. The next morning, Ethan's father woke up with a sense of purpose. He had spent the night thinking about how to present the evidence in a way that would leave no room for doubt. This wasn't just about punishing Mr. Grayson. It was about protecting his son and ensuring that no other child would suffer the same treatment. With the recording safely tucked into his pocket, he headed to the school, his steps firm and determined. When he arrived, the school secretary greeted him politely but seemed surprised by his request to meet with the principal immediately. "Is everything all right?" she asked cautiously, noticing the seriousness in his tone. "It will be," he replied, his voice steady. "But I need to speak with the principal now." Moments later, he was seated across from Mrs. Carter, the school's principal. She was a kind-looking woman with glasses perched on her nose and an air of authority that commanded respect. Still, there was warmth in her demeanor, and Ethan's father hoped she would listen without bias. "I'm here because my son, Ethan, has been treated unfairly by one of your teachers," he began, laying out the situation as clearly as possible. He explained how Mr. Grayson had taken Ethan's lunch every day under the pretense of inspection, leaving the boy hungry and humiliated. At first, Mrs. Carter looked skeptical, glancing at him over her glasses. Teachers like Mr. Grayson were known for their strictness, but outright theft, it sounded far-fetched. "That's a serious accusation," she said carefully. "Do you have any proof?" Without hesitation, Ethan's father pulled out the small recording device and placed it on her desk. "This should explain everything," he said, pressing play. The room fell silent except for the sounds coming from the recorder, the crinkling of the sandwich wrapper, the crunch of the apple, and the unmistakable noises of someone eating. Most stunning of all was the faint rustle of the brown paper bag being opened at Mr. Grayson's desk. Mrs. Carter's eyes widened as she listened. Her expression shifted from skepticism to shock, then to anger. When the recording ended, she sat back in her chair, visibly shaken. I can't believe this," she murmured, shaking her head. "Mr. Grayson has always been strict, but this is beyond unacceptable." She picked up the phone and called Mr. Grayson into her office immediately. When the teacher arrived, his usual confident stride faltered slightly as he noticed the tense atmosphere. "You wanted to see me, Mrs. Carter?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. "Sit down, Mr. Grayson," she instructed sharply. Once he was seated, she played the recording again. His face turned pale as the truth unfolded before him. There was no denying what the audio revealed. He had been caught red-handed, literally eating a student's lunch. "What is this?" Mr. Grayson stammered, trying to regain composure. "It's not what it sounds like." "Oh, really?" Mrs. Carter interrupted, her voice cold and firm. "Then please explain why we have audio evidence of you consuming food that belongs to a child who depends on that meal to get through the school day." For once, Mr. Grayson was speechless. His usual authoritative demeanor crumbled under the weight of the evidence. He fidgeted in his seat, avoiding eye contact as the gravity of his actions sank in. Ethan's father leaned forward, his voice calm but laced with steel. "My son has gone hungry because of you. He's been humiliated and made to feel powerless. Do you understand the impact your behavior has had on him?" Mrs. Carter nodded solemnly. "Rest assured, Mr. Grayson, this matter will be dealt with swiftly and appropriately. You are suspended effective immediately pending further investigation." Turning to Ethan's father, she added, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We take these allegations very seriously, and I assure you, steps will be taken to ensure this never happens again." As they left the office, Ethan's father felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. Justice was finally within reach. But more importantly, he knew that Ethan could return to school knowing that someone had stood up for him, and that the man who had wronged him would face consequences for his actions. That evening, when Ethan heard the news, he felt a wave of emotions: relief, pride, and even a little disbelief. For so long, he had felt powerless against Mr. Grayson's cruelty. Now, thanks to his father's clever plan and unwavering support, he could walk into school with his head held high, knowing that fairness and accountability still existed in the world. The news of Mr. Grayson's suspension spread quickly through the school, like ripples in a pond after a stone is thrown. Teachers whispered about it in the staff room, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. How could someone they thought they knew, a man who prided himself on discipline and order, be capable of such behavior? Parents began talking too, some expressing outrage, while others wondered how long this had been going on unnoticed. The students, however, were slower to catch on. To them, Mr. Grayson had always been strict, but few suspected anything beyond that. For Ethan, though, the change was immediate and profound. When he walked into class the next day, he felt lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For weeks, he had dreaded seeing Mr. Grayson, dreading the moment when his lunch would be taken away. But now, there was no teacher glaring at him from behind the desk. Instead, a substitute teacher greeted the class with a warm smile, her voice friendly and encouraging. It was strange at first, almost surreal, but Ethan couldn't help feeling a spark of hope. Maybe things really could be different. Word eventually reached the other students about why Mr. Grayson was gone. At first, many didn't believe it. "You're saying he stole lunches?" one boy asked incredulously during recess, his sandwich halfway to his mouth. Others laughed nervously, unsure whether to take it seriously. But as more details emerged, thanks to quiet conversations among teachers and parents, the truth became impossible to ignore. Some kids looked at Ethan differently after that, not with pity but with newfound respect. They realized he had endured something none of them had even imagined, and yet he had found a way to fight back. Ethan's classmates weren't the only ones affected by the revelation. The school administration launched a thorough investigation into Mr. Grayson's conduct, reviewing past complaints and speaking to current and former students. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. While no one else reported stolen lunches, several students admitted to feeling intimidated or unfairly treated by him over the years. One former student recalled being humiliated in front of the class for forgetting homework. Another remembered crying silently at her desk after receiving harsh criticism for a minor mistake. These stories added layers to the case against Mr. Grayson, showing that his actions went beyond isolated incidents. They revealed a pattern of cruelty disguised as discipline. Meanwhile, Mrs. Carter, the principal, took steps to ensure something like this would never happen again. She held meetings with the staff, emphasizing the importance of kindness and fairness in teaching. Our job isn't just to educate, she reminded them, but to nurture and protect our students. She also introduced new policies requiring transparency in how teachers handled student belongings and encouraged open communication between parents, students, and faculty. Posters went up around the school reminding everyone that bullying, whether by peers or adults, would not be tolerated. At home, Ethan's father watched his son closely, noticing subtle changes in his demeanor. Ethan seemed more confident, less hesitant to share what happened at school each day. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Ethan spoke openly about how relieved he felt. "I don't have to worry anymore," he said softly, tracing patterns on the tabletop with his finger. "It's like I can breathe again." His father smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You should be proud of yourself, Ethan. You stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. That takes courage." Ethan nodded, though he knew the credit wasn't entirely his. Without his father's clever plan and unwavering support, he might still be suffering in silence. Still, he couldn't deny the sense of empowerment growing inside him. For so long, he had felt small and powerless, but now he understood that standing up for yourself didn't mean doing it alone. Sometimes it meant trusting others enough to ask for help and having the bravery to believe that things could change. As days turned into weeks, life at school slowly returned to normal, or rather, a new kind of normal. The atmosphere felt lighter, friendlier. Even the substitute teacher noticed it, commenting on how eager the students seemed to participate in class discussions. For Ethan, every laugh shared with a classmate, every moment of genuine connection, felt like proof that the darkness he'd experienced was fading. And though Mr. Grayson's name occasionally came up in hushed tones, it carried less weight with each passing day. Justice had been served, and for Ethan, that was enough. As the weeks passed, the absence of Mr. Grayson became less of a topic of conversation and more of a quiet relief for everyone at school. The substitute teacher, Mrs. Harper, brought a warmth to the classroom that had been missing before. She greeted students with a smile each morning, encouraged them to ask questions without fear of judgment, and made learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. For Ethan, this shift was transformative. He no longer dreaded walking into class or felt the need to shrink into the background. Instead, he began raising his hand during lessons, sharing answers, and even cracking jokes that earned laughter from his classmates. It was as if a part of him, a confident, curious part, had been waiting all along for permission to come out. The change wasn't just limited to Ethan. Other students seemed to blossom under Mrs. Harper's guidance. Kids who once hesitated to speak up now eagerly joined group discussions. Those who had struggled with certain subjects found themselves asking for help without shame. Even recess felt different. Games were more inclusive, laughter rang louder, and fewer arguments broke out over rules or teams. Slowly but surely, the oppressive cloud that Mr. Grayson had cast over the classroom dissolved, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. Inspired by what she saw happening in her son's life, Ethan's mother decided to get involved at the school. She started volunteering in the cafeteria, helping serve lunches and ensuring every child had enough to eat. At first, some kids were shy around her, unsure why a parent would take time out of their day to be there. But her kindness won them over quickly. She remembered names, complimented artwork pinned to bulletin boards, and always made sure no one sat alone during lunch. One afternoon, while handing Ethan his tray, she noticed another boy sitting quietly in the corner, picking at his food. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. The boy looked up, startled, then shook his head. With a reassuring smile, she sat beside him and listened as he shared his worries about falling behind in math. By the end of the week, she had arranged for extra tutoring sessions after school, making sure he didn't feel left behind. Ethan watched his mother's efforts with pride. Seeing her step up reminded him how much power people could have when they cared enough to act. Her presence at the school also helped bridge gaps between parents and teachers, fostering open communication that hadn't existed before. Parents began attending meetings more regularly, voicing concerns and offering suggestions. Teachers, in turn, shared updates about curriculum changes and ways families could support learning at home. The entire school community grew stronger because of these small yet meaningful connections. Meanwhile, rumors about Mr. Grayson circulated sporadically. Some said he had resigned altogether, unable to face the scandal. Others claimed he moved to another town, hoping to start fresh where no one knew his past. Whatever the truth, it didn't matter much to Ethan anymore. What mattered was that justice had been served, not just for him, but for anyone else who might have suffered silently under Mr. Grayson's rule. Knowing that the teacher couldn't hurt anyone else gave Ethan a deep sense of satisfaction. At home, Ethan's relationship with his father grew even closer. They spent evenings talking about everything from school projects to dreams for the future. One night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in the summer air, Ethan turned to his dad and said, "I'm glad we did what we did. It made things better. For me and maybe for other kids too." His father smiled, ruffling his hair affectionately. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about fixing your own problems. It's about making sure others don't have to go through the same thing. You showed courage, Ethan. Don't ever forget that. Ethan nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. Courage, that was a word he liked. It described not only what he had done, but also what his parents had taught him. That strength comes not from fighting alone, but from believing in fairness, asking for help when needed, and trusting that good can triumph over bad. As he drifted off to sleep that night, he dreamed of brighter days ahead, days filled with laughter, friendship, and the knowledge that he had played a part in creating a kinder world. Years later, Ethan sat on the porch of his childhood home, now painted a fresh coat of white and surrounded by flowers his mother had planted. He was no longer the quiet, uncertain boy who had once dreaded going to school. Instead, he was a young man preparing to graduate from college, with plans to become a teacher himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. Someone who had once feared authority figures now wanted to inspire others in the same way Mrs. Harper had inspired him years ago. As he sipped a cup of coffee, Ethan thought back to that pivotal moment in 5th grade when everything changed. The memory of Mr. Grayson still lingered faintly, but it didn't carry the bitterness it once did. Over time, Ethan had come to see the situation not as something that defined him, but as a turning point, a lesson in resilience, courage, and the importance of standing up for what's right. It taught him that even the smallest acts of bravery could spark monumental change. Ethan often reflected on how much his family had shaped him during those difficult times. His father's clever plan and unwavering support showed him that solving problems sometimes required creativity and teamwork, and his mother's decision to volunteer at the school reminded him that kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways you might never fully realize. Together, they had turned a painful experience into an opportunity to grow, not just for Ethan, but for their entire community. The school itself had transformed too. After Mr. Grayson's departure, Mrs. Carter worked tirelessly to create a more positive environment. She introduced programs to celebrate student achievements, encouraged teachers to focus on empathy alongside academics, and fostered open communication between parents and staff. These changes helped build trust within the school community, ensuring that students felt safe and valued. By the time Ethan reached middle school, the shadow of fear that once hung over the building had vanished completely. When Ethan decided to pursue teaching, some people were surprised. "Why would you want to go back to a classroom after what happened?" a friend once asked. But Ethan knew exactly why. He wanted to be the kind of teacher he wished he had growing up. Someone who listened, who believed in their students, and who made learning exciting rather than intimidating. He envisioned a classroom where kids felt empowered to ask questions, make mistakes, and discover their potential without fear of judgment. During his final semester of college, Ethan returned to his old elementary school to observe a class. Walking through the familiar hallways brought back memories. The creaky floorboards, the faint smell of chalk dust, the murals on the walls that hadn't changed much over the years. When he stepped into the room where Mrs. Harper now taught full-time, he couldn't help but smile. Her energy was infectious, her passion evident in every interaction with her students. Watching her reminded him of why he had chosen this path. Afterward, Mrs. Harper pulled him aside and said, "You've grown into such a remarkable young man, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Her words meant the world to him, but what she said next stuck with him even more. "Remember, teaching isn't about being perfect. It's about making a difference, one child at a time." Ethan carried those words with him as he began his career. On his first day as a teacher, he stood nervously in front of his own classroom, scanning the sea of curious faces before him. Among them was a shy girl sitting in the corner, her head bowed over her notebook. Something about her reminded him of himself all those years ago. As he started the lesson, he made sure to include her, calling on her gently and praising her contributions. By the end of the day, she looked up at him with a tentative smile, one he recognized immediately. It was the same smile he had worn when he finally realized he wasn't alone. Looking back on his journey, Ethan understood that true strength wasn't about holding grudges or seeking revenge. It was about rising above pain and using your experiences to help others. Mr. Grayson's actions had hurt him deeply, but they had also given him a purpose: to ensure no child ever felt invisible or powerless again. In the end, the real victory wasn't punishing the teacher, it was reclaiming his dignity and inspiring change. And as Ethan continued down his path, he knew he was doing exactly what he was meant to do, lighting the way for others, just as someone had once lit the way for him.